Hi there, fellow philosophers. Ever catch yourself pondering, like really pondering, how your thoughts actually manage to be about things out there in the world?
It's one of those deceptively simple questions that quickly leads you down a rabbit hole of, well, really profound philosophical puzzles.
Right. It feels so basic, so intuitive, but when you try to explain it, things get complicated fast.
Absolutely. And today we're diving headfirst into that very rabbit hole with causal theories of mental content.
These theories, at their core, are trying to figure out how our internal mental states, our thoughts, our beliefs, our desires, how they actually connect with the external world. How does that thought of, say, a juicy red apple actually latch onto and represent a real physical apple out there?
It's a question that goes right to the heart of representation and meaning. And to guide our exploration, you've brought us the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on causal theories of mental content.
Yeah, it's a dense but fascinating piece, and our mission today is to, I guess, extract the most crucial philosophical insights from it. What are the core arguments? What are the major challenges these theories face? And what are the implications for our understanding of mind and world?
We'll definitely be digging into all of that. We'll start with that core intuition that drives these theories, and then we'll really put it to the test by examining the key complexities and objections that arise when you try to build a robust philosophical framework around this idea.
Okay, so let's lay the groundwork. The basic idea of causal theories is, in a nutshell, that your thought of a dog is about dogs, because dogs themselves are involved in causing that thought to pop up in your mind.
And it's important to remember, for you as a philosopher thinking about the history of ideas, that this approach didn't just spring up out of nowhere. It arose partly from dissatisfaction with those older picture theories of meaning.
Right, the ones that said, oh, our thoughts are about things because they resemble them. But as any philosopher quickly realizes, resemblance is symmetrical.
Exactly. A portrait of Plato resembles Plato, and Plato resembles the portrait. But the word Plato means Plato. Plato doesn't mean the word Plato, meaning has this directionality, this asymmetry that simple resemblance doesn't capture.
And this is where that classic example of the Judy and Trudy twins photograph becomes so illuminating. You have this identical photograph, but what makes it a photograph of Judy and not Trudy if they're indistinguishable?
The causal history is what makes all the difference. Judy was there, causally involved in the creation of that image. Judy wasn't. So the aboutness of the photograph hinges on that specific causal link.
It's that everyday observation that a cause, leaves its mark, like the number of rings in a tree stump representing its age or smoke indicating fire.
Natural meanings grounded in causation. And what the causal theories of mental content try to do is extend this basic idea to the much more complex realm of our internal mental representations.
So we're taking that basic intuition about causation and scaling it up to explain how our thoughts get hooked onto the world.
Precisely. Yeah. And in the development of these theories, we see some, I'd say, pivotal figures emerging.
Like who?
Well, you have Stamp back in '77. He really laid down an early marker by highlighting this contrast with the picture theories. And crucially, as any good philosopher would, he raised that initial problem. How do we distinguish the right kind of causes, the content-determining causes, from just any old cause?
Yeah, we don't want my thought of dog to mean sound of a passing truck, just because a truck happened to drive by when I saw a dog once.
Right, exactly. Stamp was already grappling with that challenge of filtering out those accidental or adventitious causes, as he called them.
Then you have Dretsky coming along in the 80s, bringing in his information semantics. He wasn't satisfied with just simple causation. He wanted to think about the information that's being carried by that causal link.
And he also brought in the idea of function. The thought being that the purpose or function of a mental representation might be key to determining what it's about.
So not just one thing bumping into another, but a signal conveying specific information about its source and having a certain job to do in our cognitive system.
Right. It's about what the representation is for, which helps us pin down what it's about. And then comes, I'd say, the big hitter, Fodor.
Fodor in the mid-80s, with his usual sharpness, zeroing in on what became a central problem for these theories, the disjunction problem.
He famously asks if both dogs and, say, foxes in really bad lighting can cause the same mental representation, let's call it X. Why does X mean dog and not the disjunctive dog or fox?
Right. If my mental state X can be triggered by both a dog and something that just kind of looks like a dog under certain conditions, how can a purely causal account tell me what X really means?
This is a huge problem for any theory that wants to ground meaning in natural causal terms. Because if every misrepresentation just expands the content to include whatever caused the error, then the very notion of error, of a thought being wrong about something, would just disappear.
You'd never be able to have a false belief. Every belief would just kind of encompass whatever happened to cause it.
And that would have massive implications for epistemology, for our understanding of knowledge and justification.
So, a good theory of mental content, especially for us philosophers interested in how knowledge works, needs to be able to explain how our thoughts can be directed at specific things, even if they're sometimes triggered by other things.
The disjunction problem really throws that fundamental requirement into sharp relief. And it's been a major driving force in the development and refinement of causal theories ever since Fodor put his finger on it.
Okay, so the disjunction problem sets the stage. What are some of the ways philosophers have tried to address this thorny issue?
Well, one of the earliest attempts, kind of a first stab at it, involved appealing to the idea of normal conditions.
Okay, so normal conditions. What does that mean in this context?
The basic idea, pretty intuitive on the surface, is that the content-determining causes, the ones that really tell us what a thought is about, are the ones that operate under, typical ideal circumstances.
So if you're hallucinating on LSD or someone's sticking electrodes in your brain and directly stimulating certain neurons, the resulting thoughts, those wouldn't count because the conditions aren't normal.
Right. Or even in the case of the fox in Bad Lighting, you might say those aren't normal viewing conditions for reliably identifying a dog. So maybe we can just exclude those kinds of cases.
It's kind of like saying, look, we need to filter out those weird, aberrant causal pathways that don't reflect how our minds usually interact with the world.
Precisely. But as the SEP entry meticulously lays out, this normal conditions approach, well, it runs into some pretty deep philosophical difficulties. Well, for one, it doesn't necessarily exclude those causal intermediaries that are always present in perception. Even when you're looking at a dog in perfect sunlight, your dog thought is still being proximately caused by the retinal image of the dog, the pattern of light hitting your eyes. So why doesn't your thought mean retinal image of a dog then?
It seems like you're just pushing the problem back a step. Instead of the fox, now we have to worry about the retinal projection.
Exactly. And then there's the, I'd say, inherently problematic task of actually defining what normal conditions are.
Yeah. How do you define good lighting for seeing a dog without already having a concept of a dog and what it typically looks like?
It feels like you need to bake in some of that semantic knowledge you're trying to explain in order to specify the conditions under which that knowledge arises.
It starts to feel circular, right?
Very much so.
Mm.
And even if we could somehow specify these conditions so that only dogs cause the dog thought under these specific conditions, we're still left with the question of why that thought means dog and not dog under these very specific normal conditions.
Right. It's not just about the object, it's about the object in a particular context.
Exactly. So while the appeal to normal conditions has some initial plausibility, it seems to stumble on these really fundamental philosophical challenges about defining those conditions and dealing with those unavoidable causal intermediaries.
Okay, so normal conditions hit a snag. What other avenues have philosophers explored?
Well, another prominent approach focuses on the idea of evolutionary functions.
Functions. So we're bringing in a bit of teleology here.
Absolutely. The core idea is that the purpose or function of a mental representation, the job it was designed to do by natural selection, is what determines its content.
So if having a mental representation that reliably signaled the presence of a dog helped our ancestors avoid getting bitten by those dogs, then the function of that representation gets tied to actual dogs, not just anything that happens to look like one.
Exactly. The classic example is the rabbit and the dog. If rabbits with neural circuitry that fires when they detect a dog are more likely to survive and pass on those genes, then natural selection is going to favor those dog neurons. The function of that neural firing becomes representing dogs as a threat.
Okay, I see how that fits with an evolutionary perspective. But the SEP entry brings up that tricky dog look-alike objection, right?
Oh, absolutely. How can we be sure that natural selection favored a sensitivity to dogs specifically, rather than a more general sensitivity to anything that looks remotely predator-like? From a survival standpoint, a broader category might be even more beneficial.
Right. If the advantage comes from being able to quickly identify and react to any potential threat, then maybe what's being selected for is a predator detector, not a dog detector.
That's the challenge.
Yeah.
It becomes very difficult to pin down the precise object of selection, the specific content of that representation, without already relying on intentional notions like predator or dog that we're trying to explain in the first place.
It's like we need some prior understanding of meaning to even talk about what's being selected for. And the entry also raises a good point about the plausibility of natural selection operating at such a fine-grained level of detail.
Right. While evolution undoubtedly shapes our brains and our cognitive abilities, it's less clear that it works at the level of individual concepts like dog versus fox. It might be more plausible that selection favors more general learning mechanisms, the capacity to form categories and make distinctions, rather than pre-wiring us with specific concepts.
Okay, so evolutionary functions face some serious pushback. Are there other functionalist approaches?
There are. Another prominent one shifts the focus from the grand evolutionary timescale to the individual's learning history. This is the idea of developmental functions.
Okay, so we're zooming in from the species level to the individual level. How does this work?
The thought here is that a mental representation, say X, comes to be about dogs because through the process of learning and interacting with the world, it acquires the function of reliably responding to the presence of dogs.
So a child sees a furry creature, hears someone say dog, and that mental representation X gets activated. Over time, through repeated exposure and feedback, that representation becomes strongly associated with actual dogs.
Right. It develops the function of reliably picking out dogs from the environment. So if that child later misidentifies a fox as a dog, it's a mistake because X has acquired the function of representing dogs, not foxes.
This does seem to address some of those concerns about the hyperspecificity of evolutionary selection. But the SEPI entry points out some issues with this approach too, right?
It does. For one, the line between when learning is happening and when a representation has settled into its stable function can be pretty blurry. Learning is often gradual and continuous, so it's not always clear when we can say, okay, this representation now definitively means this.
It's not like there's a light switch that flips from learning to learned.
Exactly. And then there's that crucial point about the potential reliance on the teacher's intentions during learning. If the teacher is intentionally trying to get the child to learn that X means dog, are we then grounding the meaning of X in another mental state, the teacher's intention, which itself already have content?
It feels like we're smuggling in some pre-existing meaning to explain how meaning gets established in the first place.
And that could be a problem, especially if the goal is to provide a naturalistic account of mental content. We don't want to have to appeal to some mysterious non-physical realm of intentions to explain how our thoughts get hooked onto the world.
Okay, so both evolutionary and developmental functions, while offering some interesting insights, run into some pretty fundamental philosophical roadblocks. Where do we go from here?
Well, this brings us to Fodor again and his, I'd say, more direct and perhaps more radical approach, the isometric dependency theory, or ADT.
All right, let's unpack ADT. What's the core idea here?
Instead of focusing on conditions or functions, ADT shifts the attention to the relationships between different causal laws.
Causal laws. So we're getting into the nitty-gritty of how causes and effects are linked.
Exactly. Let's go back to our trusty dog example. The causal law, dogs cause X, is considered, the fundamental one. Now, the law foxes cause X only holds because foxes sometimes get mistaken for dogs, and crucially because dogs already cause X.
So the causal connection from foxes to X is dependent on there already being a causal connection from dogs to X.
Precisely. And this dependency, Fodor argues, is asymmetric. If you somehow broke the law dogs cause X, you'd also break the law foxes cause X. But if you only broke the law foxes cause X, the law dogs cause X could still hold.
Okay, so the relationship isn't symmetrical. It's not like both dogs and foxes are on equal footing in terms of their causal power over that representation. The fox caused X is contingent on the dog caused X in a way that the dog caused X isn't contingent on the fox caused X.
Exactly. And Fodor is very clear that this dependency is synchronic, meaning it's not about a temporal sequence of events, it's about the structure of those causal laws at a given moment.
So it's not about learning history, but about how those causal relationships hang together right now.
Right. This simultaneity is crucial to avoid counterexamples like Pavlovian conditioning, where a bell causes salivation only because it was previously paired with food. The meaning of salivation doesn't suddenly become bell just because of that temporal association.
It's not about a chain of events. It's about a specific kind of dependence between causal laws.
Precisely. And this is how ADT attempts to address the disjunction problem. The causal link between dog or fox and X is dependent on the more fundamental link between dog and X.
So breaking the dog to X connection would also break the dog or fox to X connection, but breaking the dog or fox to X connection wouldn't necessarily break the dog to X connection.
That asymmetry is key to determining the content of that representation. It's a clever move, but like any good philosophical theory, ADT has faced its share of objections.
Like what? What are some of the challenges that philosophers have raised?
Well, one major issue is the problem of non-psychological interventions, those cases we talked about earlier. Things like LSD or direct electrical stimulation of the brain.
Right, the cases where you're directly messing with the brain, bypassing the usual sensory pathways.
Exactly. These interventions could potentially cause the mental event X to occur entirely independently of any dog being present. If that's the case, then the law microelectrodes cause X wouldn't seem to depend on the law dogs cause X, directly contradicting the asymmetry condition.
So it's a challenge to the idea that the dog to X connection is truly fundamental.
Right, and then we have that familiar problem of causal intermediaries popping up again. If there's always a chain of events between seeing a dog and having the thought dog, the retinal image, the signals traveling along the optic nerve, the activity in the visual cortex, then maybe X actually means sensory projection of a dog, not dog itself.
So we're back to the problem of the thought being about something too close to the brain, not the actual object out there in the world.
Exactly. And another interesting challenge comes from cases of indistinguishable kinds.
Indistinguishable kinds.
Yeah, like the classic example of jadeite and nephrite. These are two distinct minerals that were historically both called jade because they were very difficult to tell apart. Now imagine someone has a mental representation X for jade.
Okay, so X means jade based on their experience.
But the problem is that both jadeite and nephrite would have been causing X. So the laws jadeite causes X and nephrite causes X would seem to have a symmetrical dependency. Blocking one would likely block the other because they were treated as the same thing. And that symmetry is a problem for ADT.
Because ADT relies on that asymmetry to pick out the content determining cause.
Exactly. And then there's a deeper worry that maybe ADT is subtly presupposing meaning in its attempt to explain meaning.
Okay, how so?
Well, the question is, why should foxes cause X only because dogs do, unless there's already some kind of pre-existing association or perceived similarity between dogs and foxes in our mental landscape? It's like we need some prior notion of dogness and foxness to explain why those causal relationships are structured the way they are.
It feels like we're trying to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, using meaning to explain meaning.
It's a valid concern. So while ADT offers a very elegant and potentially powerful solution to the disjunction problem, these objections raise serious questions about its ultimate success as a complete theory of mental content.
Okay, so we've looked at normal conditions, evolutionary functions, developmental functions, and now ADT. Are there any other notable contenders in the causal theory arena?
There are. One that's gained traction in recent years is Robert Rupert's best test theory, or BTT. Interestingly, BTT focuses specifically on mental representations of natural kind terms.
Natural kind terms. So we're talking about things like animals, plants, minerals, chemical elements, things that seem to have a kind of objective existence in the world.
Right. BTT isn't trying to explain the meaning of all our thoughts, but rather zeroing in on this specific category of terms.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the core principle of BTT?
It says that a mental representation X for a natural kind K means K if and only if members of K are more efficient in causing X than are members of any other natural kind.
Efficiency being the key word here, not just the frequency of encounters.
Absolutely. Rupert uses the analogy of a spreadsheet biography to illustrate this. Imagine tracking all of an organism's encounters with different natural kinds and the mental representations that get triggered.
So you're keeping a record of every time the organism sees a dog, a fox, a cat, a tree, whatever, and noting which mental representations fire.
Precisely. And efficiency is about the conditional probability of that representation firing, given the presence of that kind. It's about how reliably and consistently a particular kind triggers a specific representation across those various encounters and contexts.
Okay, so even if I see dogs more often than foxes in my daily life, if foxes only trigger my dog representation under very specific conditions, say in bad lighting or at a distance, while dogs trigger it consistently across a wider range of situations, then my dog representation really means dog, according to BTT.
That's the gist of it. It's not just about how often I see those things, but about the reliability and consistency of that causal link.
I see how that might help address the disjunction problem. But how does BTT deal with those tricky brain intervention cases, like the LSD example?
It has a few lines of defense. First, it grounds meaning in an individual's actual history of causal interactions. So, hypothetical scenarios like someone stimulating your brain might not be relevant if they haven't actually happened to you.
Okay, so it's about your real world experience, not what ifs.
Right. Second, BTT is specifically about natural kinds. So something like LSD or microelectrodes, those might not fall under the relevant category of natural kinds.
It's a bit like saying those things are outside the game that BTT is playing.
In a sense, yes. And third, the effects of something like LSD on the brain are likely to be quite diffuse, triggering a whole bunch of different mental representations in an inconsistent way. It wouldn't be the most efficient cause of any single natural kind representation.
So it wouldn't meet that efficiency threshold that BTT sets for meaning.
Precisely. But BTT doesn't escape unscathed. The SEP entry points out a potential issue with how it handles questions.
Questions. How do those pose a problem?
Well, imagine a child who repeatedly hears the question, what animal goes moo? And this question consistently triggers their cow representation.
Okay, so the question becomes a reliable cue for that mental representation.
Right. But now that question might become a more efficient cause of their cow representation than actual encounters with cows, especially if they don't see cows very often. And that would lead to the strange conclusion that cow actually means what animal goes moo, according to BTT.
That does seem counterintuitive. It's like the meaning gets attached to the linguistic prompt instead of the natural kind itself.
Exactly. And then, of course, we have the perennial problem of proximal sensory projections rearing its head again.
Right. That issue of the sensory signals being the more immediate and efficient cause than the actual object out there in the world.
It's a challenge that all causal theories have to grapple with, and BTT is no exception. The entry suggests that the success of BTT might hinge on arguing that those proximal sensory projections aren't themselves natural kinds in the relevant sense.
Okay, so maybe they're just considered intermediaries, part of the causal chain, but not the endpoint that determines meaning.
That's one way to try to salvage the theory, but it's certainly a point of contention.
So we've seen a whole range of causal theories, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, each trying to address that core disjunction problem in its own way.
It's a testament to the complexity of the issue, that there's no single, universally accepted solution. And beyond the debates within the causal theory camp, there are also those broader, more fundamental objections that challenge the very idea of grounding meaning in causation at all.
Right, the big picture questions about whether causation, no matter how cleverly we try to define it, can truly capture the essence of meaning.
Exactly. Those are the questions that really get to the heart of the philosophical project here.
So let's dive into some of those broader objections. One that immediately comes to mind is the problem of logical and mathematical terms.
Ah, yes. The classic challenge for any naturalistic theory of meaning. How can causal theories possibly explain the meaning of abstract terms like and or not equals greater than? These terms refer to logical operations and mathematical relations. It's really hard to imagine any kind of direct causal interaction we could have with the concept of negation or the addition function.
Right, it's not like those concepts are out there in the world bumping into us, causing our thoughts.
Precisely. So, how can a causal theory account for our understanding of these terms? The standard response is often to say, look, we're not claiming to provide necessary conditions for all meaning. Maybe causal connections are sufficient for certain types of representations, like those of concrete objects and natural kinds, but not for abstract concepts.
So it's a kind of strategic retreat. They're saying, okay, maybe causation isn't the whole story, but it's still an important part of the story for a certain class of mental representations.
Exactly, but that still leaves the question of how those other types of meaning are grounded.
Right. It's a bit of a promissory note, like, we'll figure out those other cases later. But then there's that whole issue of vacuous terms.
Ah, yes. Words and concepts for things that don't actually exist. Unicorns, phlogiston, a fountain of youth. We can clearly think about these things, reason about them, tell stories about them.
But if meaning requires a causal link to the object being represented, How can these terms be meaningful when there's no such object to causally interact with?
It's a puzzle, and it's a challenge that causal theorists have to address. Some try to argue that for general terms like unicorn, there might still be a kind of conceptual rule, a unicorn law, even if there are no actual unicorns.
Okay, so maybe it's a law that specifies the properties a thing would need to have to count as a unicorn, even if no such thing exists.
Right. But for singular terms, like Vulcan, the hypothetical planet that doesn't exist, it gets trickier. Another common strategy is to say that these seemingly simple terms are actually complex, composed of more basic concepts that do have causal grounding.
So, unicorn might be broken down into horse plus horn, both of which we have experience with.
Exactly. But that strategy might not work for all vacuous terms. And then we have the intriguing argument put forward by Horgan and Teenson concerning phenomenal intentionality.
Phenomenal intentionality. That sounds pretty deep. What's the gist of their argument?
They're challenging the very idea that causal connections are necessary for intentionality. They say that some aspects of aboutness might arise purely from the phenomenology of our experience, from what it feels like to have a certain mental state.
So, the feeling of seeing a red apple might be inherently about a red apple, even if there's no actual red apple out there in the world causing that feeling.
That's their claim. It's about the intrinsic character of the experience itself.
Okay, so if two people are perfect phenomenological duplicates, having the exact same subjective experience, then their mental states would have the same content, even if one of them is in a world where red apples don't exist.
Right. That's the challenge. It's about whether phenomenology can ground intentionality independently of any external causal connection.
That's a radical idea. How do representationalists respond to this?
Well, the standard counterargument is that even our phenomenology might arise from the representational properties of our mental states, and those representational properties are ultimately determined by our causal history.
So it's not that phenomenology is somehow fundamental and independent. It's that the feeling of seeing red is itself a kind of representation, and that representation gets its content from our interactions with the world.
That's the line of defense. But it's a debate that's still very much alive within the philosophy of mind.
Another fascinating challenge comes from Burroughs' argument concerning reflexive thoughts.
Ah, yes. The thoughts that take themselves as their own object. Like the thought, this very thought is false.
Right, a classic self-referential paradox.
Burroughs points out that nothing can be the cause of itself in the way that causal theories seem to require for meaning. So how can a self-referential thought like that derive its meaning from being caused by its own falsity?
It's a head-scratcher, for sure. But I think it's important to remember that most causal theorists are proposing sufficient conditions for meaning, not necessary ones.
Right. It's not about saying that every meaningful thought has to be caused by its referent. It's about saying that causation can be one way that meaning arises.
So even if reflexive thoughts pose a problem for causal theories, it doesn't necessarily mean that causation can't play a role in explaining other kinds of meaning.
Exactly. It might just mean that causation isn't the whole story.
And then we have those cases of reliable misrepresentations, thoughts that are systematically wrong about the world.
Right. Like if I had a concept of phlogiston, but phlogiston doesn't actually exist, or if I lived in a world where there were no colors, but I still had color concepts.
How can a causal theory explain those cases if there's no actual thing out there causing those representations?
It's a tough one. Causal theorists have to come up with ways to account for how our thoughts can be about things that aren't real. Some argue that our theories of content don't need to commit to a realist metaphysics for every concept we possess.
Okay, so we can have meaningful thoughts about things that don't exist, even if those thoughts don't correspond to anything in the real world.
That's the idea. And then we have Cummins' argument about the theory mediation of perception. This one gets into the nitty-gritty of how perception works.
Okay, lay it on me.
Cummins argues that in order to even perceive something like a dog, to have that dog causally influence our dog representation, we need to already have a kind of implicit theory of dogs. We need to know what kinds of features and behaviors are typical of dogs.
So we need some pre-existing knowledge about dogs in order to recognize a dog when we see one.
Exactly. But then the question becomes, where did that knowledge come from?
Yeah.
If causal theories are saying that having a dog representation requires being able to causally interact with dogs, but recognizing a dog requires having a dog representation, well, it starts to look circular.
It's like the chicken and egg problem of representation.
Precisely. It raises questions about how that initial link between our minds and the world gets established if perception itself is already theory laden.
So maybe there's a kind of bootstrapping process going on where our early concepts are somehow formed, allowing us to have more sophisticated causal interactions with the world, which then lead to more refined concepts.
That's one possibility. But it's a challenge that causal theories need to address. And then there's Bridges' argument about the implementation of psychological laws, which gets into some really subtle metaphysical territory.
Metaphysics. Okay, I'm listening.
Bridges is concerned with the relationship between what something is, its constitutive properties, and how it actually works, its implementation. He argues that if meaning just is reliable causation, then we shouldn't also be explaining that reliable causation through the complex machinery of our sensory and cognitive systems.
Because that machinery is itself operating according to causal laws, right? So it's like we're explaining meaning in terms of causation and then explaining causation in terms of more causation.
It's a kind of explanatory mismatch. It's like saying that water is H2O and then explaining H2O in terms of its wetness.
Okay, I see the problem. You're using the thing you're trying to explain as part of the explanation.
Exactly. And finally, we have Artiga and Sebastian pointing out a metasemantic problem for causal theories.
Metasemantics. That sounds like we're going up another level of abstraction.
We are. They're making a distinction between explaining why a particular mental representation X means dog, and the more fundamental question of why that representation has meaning at all.
Okay, so it's one thing to say why X means dog rather than cat, but it's another thing to say what makes X meaningful in the first place.
Precisely. And they're questioning whether causal theories really address that deeper question about the ground of meaningfulness itself.
So it's not just about getting the content right, it's about explaining how content is even possible.
Exactly. But in fairness to the causal theorists, one could argue that if they're providing sufficient conditions for meaning, then they are, in a sense, offering a metasemantic answer.
Right. If they can say, look, if a mental state has these particular causal properties, then it's guaranteed to have meaning, then they've at least given us some criteria for what it takes for something to be meaningful.
That's one way to look at it, but it's a debate that continues to be explored within the philosophy of language and mind.
So, as we've seen in this deep dive, the seemingly simple idea that our thoughts get their meaning from causal connections to the world turns out to be a philosophical minefield.
It really is. There are so many layers of complexity, so many subtle distinctions, so many potential pitfalls.
We've explored a whole range of theories, normal conditions, evolutionary functions, developmental functions, ADT.